I don't remember exactly when I realized I was invisible to them. Maybe it was the night I sat at the dinner table listening to my parents argue, my plate full of untouched food. Or maybe it was the time I fell off my bike, scraped my knee open, and ran inside crying, only to find them too busy yelling at each other to even glance my way. They were always too preoccupied with something: work, money, each other. I was just there, a quiet observer of a life where I didn't seem to belong. When I was younger, I used to try. I'd draw pictures and leave them on the fridge, hoping they'd notice. I'd sit close when they watched TV, waiting for them to ask about my day. I even started doing little things, cleaning up, helping with groceries, just to see if they'd acknowledge me. They never did. I remember one evening vividly. My father had come home late, the stench of alcohol clinging to his clothes. My mother was already angry before he even stepped inside. I sat on the couch, gripping a toy car in my small hands, listening as their words got sharper, meaner. "You don't even care, do you?" My mother spat, her voice shaking. "Oh, and you do?" My father shot back. "You're just as absent as I am." I don't know why that moment stuck with me. Maybe because it was the first time I realized neither of them wanted to be there. Not with each other, not with me. And then, one day, they stopped pretending altogether. The divorce wasn't a slow unraveling. It was a snap, a clean break. One moment they were in the same house, tolerating each other's presence, and the next, they were discussing custody like I was a piece of furniture neither of them particularly wanted. "I can't take him," my mother said. "Not with my schedule." "I sure as hell can't either," my father muttered. And just like that, they found an easy solution. "We'll send him to your mother," my father said. "She won't mind," my mother agreed. They didn't ask me how I felt about it. They just packed my things and sent me away. That was the last time I lived in the same house as them. My grandmother's house was different from the one I had left behind. It was smaller, older, filled with the smell of dust and something faintly floral. The walls were lined with shelves of books, most of them worn and faded. There were no loud voices, no slamming doors, just an unsettling kind of quiet. She wasn't the affectionate type. When I arrived, she didn't wrap me in a warm hug or whisper reassurances. She simply nodded, as if she had been expecting me all along, and led me to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. The bed was neatly made, the wooden floors creaked under my footsteps, and a single window let in the softest sliver of light. "This will be your room," she said. "Dinner is at 6. That was it. No grand speech, no forced smiles, just a simple statement before she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in a house that didn't feel like mine. At first, I didn't know how to act around her. I had been ignored before, but this was different. She wasn't unkind, but she also wasn't overly interested in me. She didn't ask about my school or my parents. She didn't ask if I missed them, and I didn't bring it up. Maybe she understood that there was nothing to miss. Days turned into weeks. The silence of the house, which had once felt cold and empty, began to feel steady, safe even. My grandmother had a routine, and she expected me to fall into it. Breakfast at 7, school, dinner at 6. No small talk, no unnecessary interactions. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where I realized she noticed things about me. One evening, after a particularly bad day at school, I sat at the dinner table staring at my plate. Kids weren't cruel to me, but they weren't exactly friendly either. I was just there, much like I had been at home, invisible. I hadn't said a word about it, but my grandmother must have noticed something in the way I pushed my food around. "You like to read?" she asked, breaking the silence. I blinked at her. It wasn't the question I had been expecting, if I had been expecting anything at all. "I guess," I said. She nodded, standing up from the table. A moment later, she returned with a book, setting it down in front of me. The cover was old and faded, the pages slightly yellowed. "My father gave me this when I was your age," she said. Might as well pass it on. She didn't say anything else. She didn't try to comfort me, didn't offer any words of encouragement. But something about that moment, about the simple act of placing the book in front of me, felt more meaningful than anything my parents had ever done. It was the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere, even if it was just in a quiet house with an old woman who didn't say much. Life with my grandmother didn't change much over the years. She never became softer, never transformed into the kind of woman who baked cookies or told bedtime stories. But she was steady, reliable, and in her own way, I think she cared about me. She never asked about my parents, and I never brought them up. They called occasionally, but it was always out of obligation. A quick, "How's school?" from my mother, a distracted, "You behaving yourself?" from my father. I learned early on that these weren't real questions. They didn't expect real answers. Eventually, the calls stopped, and I didn't miss them. Instead, I focused on the quiet rhythm of life with my grandmother. We weren't close, not in the way some families are. But we had an understanding. She never pried, and I never asked for more than she could give. She showed she cared in the little things, the way she'd set out an extra blanket on cold nights, or how she always made my favorite soup when I was sick, even if she never said anything about it. She had a habit of sitting by the window in the evenings, watching the sky change colors as the sun set behind the trees. At first, I thought she was just lost in thought. But as I got older, I realized she was waiting for something, or someone. One night, when I was about 16, I finally asked, "Who are you looking for?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, her fingers lightly drumming against the wooden armrest of her chair. "No one," she finally said. But I knew that wasn't true. I never pressed her about it. Just like she never asked me if I missed my parents. We had our own ways of avoiding the past. As the years passed, I started to think of the house as mine, even though I knew it wasn't. It felt more like home than anywhere else ever had. And then, one morning, everything changed. I found her in her chair by the window, sitting still, too still. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, her face peaceful in a way that made my chest tighten. The book she had been reading was still open beside her. A cup of tea, untouched, sat on the table. For the first time in my life, the silence in the house felt unbearable. I was alone. Really, truly alone. And I had no idea what was supposed to happen next. The funeral was small, a handful of neighbors, a few distant relatives I barely recognized. They offered polite condolences, murmured something about how she had lived a long life, then disappeared as quickly as they came. And then it was just me, alone in the house that smelled like her. Every chair, every book, every piece of furniture carried some trace of her existence. But she was gone, and the house felt bigger than ever. For the first few days, I moved through it like a stranger. I expected to hear the shuffle of her slippers on the wooden floor, the soft clinking of her teacup against the saucer. But the house was silent. I had never realized how much she had filled it until she was no longer there. Then came the legal matters. A man in a stiff suit sat across from me, a folder full of paperwork between us. He spoke in a professional, measured tone, explaining terms I barely understood, and then he said something that made my mind go blank. "She left everything to you. The house, the savings, everything she owned." I stared at him, expecting some sort of mistake. I had never asked for anything. I had never even thought about what would happen after she was gone. But she had. And she had chosen to leave it all to me. I should have felt grateful, maybe even secure, knowing I wouldn't have to worry about where to go or how to live. But all I felt was an aching hollowness. What was I supposed to do with it all? I spent the next few weeks in a daze, wandering the house, going through her things without knowing what I was looking for. Old letters, faded photographs, small trinkets that probably meant something to her once. Each one was a piece of her life, but none of them told me what to do next. Then, one evening, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then answered. "Hey, kid," my father's voice said, too casual, too forced. "Been a long time?" I didn't say anything. "How have you been?" he asked, as if he actually cared, and that was when I knew. They had found out. I didn't respond right away. I just held the phone to my ear, listening to my father's voice, one I hadn't heard in years, wrap itself in artificial warmth. "I know it's been a while," he continued when I didn't speak. "I was just thinking about you. Thought I'd check in." Check in? Since when did he check in on me? Since when did he care? Then came the real reason. "I heard about your grandmother," he said, his voice dipping into something that was supposed to sound like sympathy. "I'm real sorry, kid. She was a good woman." A pause, a carefully placed silence. "Must be hard being on your own now. If you need anything—" "I don't," I said. It was the first thing I'd said since answering the call. He cleared his throat. "Well, I was just thinking, maybe we could meet up, catch up a little." Catch up, like he was an old friend I'd lost touch with, like he hadn't walked away years ago and never looked back. I didn't say anything. Then, as if on cue, my mother called the next day. She didn't pretend as much as he did. She got straight to the point. "I heard your grandmother left you the house." Not, "How are you?" Not, "I'm sorry for your loss." Straight to the inheritance. I could almost hear the calculation in her voice, the gears turning in her head. She hadn't spoken to me in years, but now, suddenly, she was concerned. "That's a lot of responsibility," she said. "Managing a house, all those expenses. Maybe you need some help." Help. That was a funny word for it. I knew what they wanted. Neither of them had wanted me before. Not when I was a kid. Not when I was growing up. But now, suddenly, I had something they wanted. I ignored them at first, let the calls go to voicemail, but they didn't stop. Then one day, my father showed up at the house. I heard the knock at the door and knew, before I even opened it, who it would be. And sure enough, there he was, hands in his pockets, wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, kid." I didn't say anything, just stared at him. He looked past me, into the house. My house. And for the first time in my life, I saw it clearly. The way his eyes lingered, the way he measured the space, the way he stood there like he already thought he had a right to it. "So," he said, still forcing that easygoing tone, "you gonna invite your old man in?" I should have felt something. Anger, sadness, maybe even guilt. But all I felt was tired, and I didn't move from the doorway. I didn't step aside. I stood in the doorway, blocking his way, feeling the weight of everything unsaid between us. My father's smile faltered, just for a second. Then he gave a small chuckle, like this was all some big misunderstanding. "Come on," he said, shifting his weight. "You're not even gonna let me in?" I thought about it. About what would happen if I let him cross that threshold. He'd step inside, look around like he already owned the place. He'd sit in my grandmother's chair, maybe even put his feet up. He'd say things to make it sound like he was here for me, but really, he'd be looking for an opening, a way in. "No," I said finally. The word came out steady, firm, stronger than I expected. My father sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Look, I get it," he said. "You're upset. You think I wasn't there for you." "I don't think. I know. But that was a long time ago," he went on. "I've changed, kid, and—" He gestured vaguely at the house. "I just want to make sure you're not making bad decisions. This is a lot to handle, you know? A lot to handle." That was his way of telling me I wasn't capable of managing my own life. His way of telling me he should be the one making the decisions. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I didn't let it show. "I'm handling it just fine," I said. His mouth twitched, like he wanted to argue. But he must have seen something in my face, something that told him I wasn't that kid he used to ignore. After a long moment, he nodded. "All right," he said, stepping back. "All right. But listen, if you ever need anything—" "I won't," I said, and closed the door. I thought that was the end of it. But then the messages started piling up. From him, from my mother. At first, they tried being nice, asking how I was, saying they just wanted to talk. When I ignored them, the guilt trips started. "We're still your parents. After everything we've done for you, this is how you treat us? Do you really want to cut us out of your life forever?" Then came the real desperation. "We just need a little help. Just a loan. Nothing big. You can afford it, right? You wouldn't leave your own parents struggling, would you? After everything, you owe us that much." I stared at those words on my phone screen, feeling nothing. Owe them? I owed them nothing. They had left me when I was a kid. Not just physically, but in every way that mattered. They had walked away, let me disappear, and now that I had something they wanted, they were trying to claw their way back in. I didn't answer. I blocked their numbers. And then, for the first time in weeks, the house was quiet again. I should have felt relieved, maybe even victorious. But as I sat alone in my grandmother's house, staring at the empty chair by the window, I felt something else. Lost. For the first time in my life, I had something of my own. No one could take it from me. No one could ignore me, dismiss me, pretend I didn't exist. So why did I feel like I was standing at the edge of something, staring into the unknown? What was I supposed to do now? I had won. Hadn't I?